In a dusty railroad town where power belonged to men in clean suits, one working-class cowboy was told to disappear. They framed him. They took his job. They ordered him to leave before sunrise. All he had left was a sick child, an injured father, and a loyal dog who refused to leave his side. But what they didn't know was this: the quiet men who work the ground learn how to listen when the world lies. And sometimes the truth survives in dust, not paper. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Abilene, Kansas, in the summer of 1890, was a hard town built for hard men. The wind blew almost constantly, carrying dust from the open plains into every street and doorway. The sun burned down without kindness, drying the ground until it cracked. Rail lines cut through the town like scars, and everything revolved around cattle, trains, and money that rarely stayed in the same hands for long. Life here was not cruel out of malice, but it was unforgiving by nature. Jake Turner had learned that early. Jake was 32 years old, tall but lean, his body shaped by years of physical labor rather than comfort. His shoulders were broad but slightly stooped, not from weakness, but from habit. His face was angular, with a strong jaw and a short, rough beard that never grew evenly. His skin was tanned dark by the sun and marked by small scars earned without ceremony. His eyes were gray-blue, steady and observant, the eyes of a man who watched more than he spoke. Jake was known among the workers as reliable, quiet, and fair. He did not complain, and he did not ask for favors. Once, Jake had been a free-range cowboy, riding open land with no schedule beyond the herd and the weather. That life ended 3 years earlier, when his older brother Samuel was killed in a riding accident. Samuel left behind a young daughter and debts he never expected to pass on. Jake stepped in without hesitation. He sold his horse, took steady work at the rail yard, and stayed in Abilene. Freedom became responsibility, and responsibility became routine. Now Jake worked loading cattle at the rail station, guiding frightened animals into narrow pens and up wooden ramps toward steel rail cars. It was heavy work, dirty and repetitive, and it paid just enough to keep his family fed. His hands were thick with calluses, his nails permanently darkened no matter how often he scrubbed them. He moved calmly among the cattle, using his voice more than force. Animals trusted calm, and Jake trusted patience. At his side stayed Daisy, his cattle dog. She was 6 years old, medium-sized, with a mottled gray and white coat and alert amber eyes. One ear bent slightly forward from an old injury. Daisy rarely barked. She watched Jake constantly and responded to small gestures and quiet commands. She had been with him since before Samuel died and stayed close no matter how long the day ran. Near the fence sat Henry Turner, Jake's father. Henry was in his late 60s, thin and pale, his left leg stiff from a rail accident that ended his blacksmithing days. His hair was white and sparse, his hands still strong but unsteady. He spoke little now, saving his energy, but his eyes followed Jake carefully, measuring each movement with concern and pride mixed together. Standing beside Henry was Emily Turner, 9 years old. She was small for her age, with narrow shoulders and dark hair braided neatly down her back. Her dress was faded and carefully mended. Emily held a cloth doll against her chest, its stitching worn thin. She watched the cattle with a serious expression, as if trying to understand a world that had already taken too much from her. Every so often, she turned away to cough quietly into her sleeve. Jake always noticed. By late afternoon, the last of the cattle were loaded. Jake wiped his face with his sleeve and walked over to his family. Daisy followed close behind. "You're done for today," Henry said. "For now," Jake replied. "Another train comes through tomorrow morning." Emily looked up. "Will you be home for supper?" Jake nodded. "I'll be there." Emily smiled briefly, then coughed again. Jake's jaw tightened slightly. Medicine cost money. Winter would come soon. There was never enough of either. As Jake turned back toward the yard, Thomas Bell, the foreman, called him over. Bell was a stocky man in his 40s, with a thick neck and a constant scowl. He respected hard workers and dismissed everyone else. "Turner," Bell said. "There's a private dinner in town tonight. Railroad men. They want extra help serving and cleaning. Pays $1. Jake hesitated only a moment. $1 was more than a full day's wages. It meant medicine. It meant a few days without worry. "I'll take it," Jake said. That evening, Jake washed as best he could, changed into his cleanest shirt, and tied his hair back neatly. Dust still clung to him. It always did. Daisy stayed behind with Henry and Emily as Jake walked into town. The dinner was held at the Grand Meridian Hall, a large building with polished floors and tall windows. Inside, the air smelled of cigars and expensive soap. Jake moved quietly among the tables, following instructions, keeping his eyes down. That was when William Harrington arrived. Harrington was a tall man in his early 50s, dressed in a dark tailored suit. His posture was straight, his movements controlled. His hair was gray, neatly combed, and his mustache carefully trimmed. His face showed little expression, but his eyes were sharp and cold. This was a man used to being obeyed. Jake was assigned to Harrington's table. Throughout the meal, Harrington made small complaints. The water was not cold enough. The bread was too dry. The service was slow. Jake responded politely and corrected each issue without argument. He showed no irritation, only efficiency. When the meal ended, Harrington stood and left without a word. Jake cleared the table and saw what had been left behind. A single coin, one tarnished nickel placed carefully where it could not be missed. Jake stared at it for a moment. He picked it up and closed his hand around it. He didn't react. He had learned that reaction was often what men like Harrington wanted most. As Jake lifted the final tray, something slid free and landed softly on the table, a folded piece of thick paper. Jake glanced around, then unfolded it enough to read the message written in firm, deliberate handwriting. "West Stockyard. Office. Midnight. Come alone." Jake folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, blowing dust through the empty streets. Jake stepped into it, the nickel heavy in his pocket, his thoughts fixed on what might come next. He walked home without slowing. The wind had not eased by the time Jake Turner reached the west side of Abilene. Near midnight, the town felt thinner, as if most of its people had retreated indoors and left only shadows behind. The stockyards lay beyond the last line of oil lamps, where the dirt road turned uneven, and the smell of cattle, iron, and old manure settled thick in the air. Clouds moved slowly across the moon, dulling its light, and the night carried a dry chill that crept through clothing and into bone. Jake walked alone, exactly as the note had instructed. His pace was steady, not hurried. Years of working cattle had taught him that rushing only led to mistakes. The nickel rested in his pocket, a small but constant reminder of the insult that had followed him home. He had not told his father or Emily about the note. Some things were better faced without witnesses. Daisy had tried to follow him when he left the house. She had stood at the door, ears forward, reading his body language with the quiet intelligence that came from years at his side. Jake had knelt, pressed his forehead briefly against hers, and told her to stay. Daisy obeyed, but not without a low whine that stayed with him as he walked away. The West Stockyard office sat apart from the main pens, a low wooden building with peeling paint and a single lantern burning above the door. Most men avoided the place at night. It was where disputes were settled, where records were kept, and where uncomfortable truths tended to surface. Jake stopped a few yards away, listening. He heard the distant shifting of cattle, the creak of fencing in the wind, and nothing else. He stepped forward and knocked once. "Come in," a voice called from inside. Jake opened the door. The room was sparse. A long table sat in the center, scarred by years of use. Shelves along the walls held ledgers and rolled maps. A coal stove stood cold in the corner. Sitting at the table was William Harrington. Without his formal coat and gloves, Harrington looked different. Still controlled, still rigid, but less polished. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing thin forearms that suggested calculation more than strength. His gray hair was slightly disordered, his mustache less precise than earlier that evening. He looked up at Jake with the same sharp eyes, but there was something else in them now. Focus. "You came," Harrington said. "I was told to," Jake replied. Harrington gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." Jake sat. He did not remove his hat. Harrington noticed but said nothing. "You know why you're here?" Harrington asked. "No," Jake said. "I don't." Harrington studied him for a moment, as if measuring his weight without a scale. "Most men would have thrown that nickel back at me, or walked away and cursed my name. You did neither." Jake shrugged slightly. Didn't see the point. That, Harrington said, is exactly the point. He reached down and placed several ledgers on the table. The books were thick, their pages yellowed and warped from years of handling. Harrington slid them toward Jake. These are shipping records, he said. Cattle weights, departure numbers, arrival confirmations. My men say the losses are normal. Weather, stress, injury. I don't agree. Jake looked at the ledgers but didn't touch them yet. Why bring me? Because you handle cattle, Harrington said. You don't sit behind a desk. You see animals as living weight, not figures. And because you didn't react tonight when I gave you reason to. Jake opened the first ledger. The handwriting was neat but inconsistent, some entries rushed, others careful. He read slowly, his brow tightening. He had never been taught accounting, but numbers tied to cattle made sense to him. Weight in, weight out, head count, loss. How long? Jake asked. 6 months, Harrington replied. Enough to hurt, not enough to be obvious. Jake flipped pages. Patterns began to emerge. The losses were not random. They clustered around certain dates, certain shipments, always small percentages, always within what most men would accept. These cattle, Jake said, tapping a line with his finger, they weren't lost in transit. Harrington leaned forward slightly. Explain. They were switched, Jake said. Before loading. Healthy stock replaced with lighter, weaker animals, or counted twice, sometimes both. Harrington's jaw tightened. You're certain? Jake nodded. You don't lose weight the same way every time unless someone plans it. Cattle don't plan. Harrington exhaled slowly. Who? Jake turned the ledger so Harrington could see the initials beside each questionable shipment. Same man signs off on most of them. HL. Harrington stared at the page. His face hardened. Harlan Locke, he said quietly. My cousin. The silence that followed felt heavy but controlled. Harrington did not shout or curse. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, colder than before. Most men would hesitate to say that, Harrington said. Jake met his gaze. Most men don't work the pens. Harrington reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He placed it on the table between them and slid it forward. Your payment, he said. Jake unfolded it. A check. The amount made his chest tighten. This is more than... Jake began. It covers what your family needs, Harrington said, and what I owe you. Jake hesitated, then folded the check carefully and placed it inside his shirt pocket. You still haven't told me why you tested me. Harrington leaned back in his chair. Because trust is expensive, and I don't buy it cheaply. He stood. This stays between us. I will handle Harlan. Jake rose as well. That's all? For tonight, Harrington said. Jake turned toward the door, then paused. That nickel, he said. You didn't leave it by accident. Harrington's mouth tightened slightly. No. Jake nodded once. He didn't ask more. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere far off. Jake walked home under the same sky, but the weight in his pocket felt different now. Not lighter, just changed. At home, Daisy lifted her head when he entered. Emily slept curled on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Henry stirred in his chair. You're back late, Henry said. Jake nodded. I had work to do. He did not elaborate. He lay down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world continued turning, and for the first time in months, Jake allowed himself to believe that turning with it might not always mean being crushed beneath it. Morning came dry and sharp, the kind that scraped the throat when a man breathed too deeply. Abilene woke early, not because it wished to, but because cattle and rail schedules did not allow for hesitation. Jake Turner stood near the edge of the rail yard as the first train of the day hissed and settled on the tracks, steam rising like a warning. He had slept little. The meeting from the night before still sat heavy in his thoughts, not as fear, but as awareness. Something had shifted. He could feel it in the way the day pressed against him. Harrington's messenger arrived just after sunrise. The man introduced himself as Edward Collins, Harrington's operations supervisor. Collins was in his late 40s, tall and narrow, with a long face and a carefully groomed dark beard streaked with gray. His clothing was clean but severe. No unnecessary decoration, no softness. His eyes were brown and sharp, always moving, always assessing. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority but not fully secure in it. Years earlier, Collins had been a bookkeeper for a failed cattle syndicate, a collapse that hardened him. Since then, he trusted numbers more than people. "Jacob Turner," Collins said, holding out a folded paper. "Mr. Harrington requests your presence at the rail office today, noon." Jake took the paper. For what purpose? Collins studied him for a moment, his gaze lingering on Jake's rough shirt and dust-worn boots. "Observation," he said. "That's all." Jake nodded. Collins turned and walked away without another word. The hours that followed passed slowly. Jake finished his shift with steady hands, but his attention drifted. He noticed Daisy pacing more than usual, her ears alert, her eyes tracking him closely. Emily sat with Henry near the fence, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. She looked better that morning. The check Harrington had given him was already folded carefully in Jake's pocket, waiting for the doctor. By noon, Jake had changed into his clean shirt again and walked into town. Harrington's rail office stood apart from the stockyards, a 2-story brick building with tall windows and a narrow iron balcony. It smelled faintly of ink and coal smoke. Inside, the floors were polished and the walls were lined with maps that showed rail lines stretching like veins across the country. Edward Collins met him at the door. "Follow me," he said. They climbed a narrow staircase to a long office where clerks worked quietly at tall desks. Men paused briefly to look up as Jake passed. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to mild disdain. Few of them had ever spent a night sleeping in the open or walked cattle through a storm. Fewer still believed such experience mattered here. Collins stopped at a door near the back. "Mr. Harrington will see you shortly," he said, then left Jake alone. The room was small but orderly. Jake stood by the window, looking down at the street. Below, wagons rolled past, men shouted, life continued at its usual pace. He felt oddly removed from it. Harrington entered without announcement. "You've never worked in an office," Harrington said, not as a question. "No," Jake replied. Harrington studied him. "Good. Offices tend to teach men the wrong lessons." He gestured toward a stack of documents on the desk. "You'll review these. Shipment schedules, crew assignments, intake reports. You won't change anything. You'll observe." Jake hesitated. "Why me?" "Because you see what my people ignore," Harrington said. "And because Collins doesn't trust you." Harrington's mouth twitched slightly. "Which means you're useful." Jake nodded. "I'll do what you ask." That afternoon, Jake worked in silence. He read carefully, comparing reports against memory and instinct. He noticed small things: crew rotations that didn't align with loading times, routes that took longer than necessary, foremen assigned where they had no experience. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, but inefficient, wasteful. Collins returned near dusk. "You're done," he said. Jake handed over the papers. Collins flipped through them quickly. "You didn't mark anything." "I wasn't asked to," Jake replied. Collins frowned, then gave a short nod. "We'll see how long that lasts." Outside, the sky had darkened, and the wind carried the smell of an approaching front. Jake walked home, his thoughts heavy. Harrington's world was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and filled with men who measured worth in ledgers and influence. He was an outsider there. He could feel it in every look, every pause in conversation. At home, Daisy greeted him immediately, pressing her head into his hand. Emily ran to him, her movements still careful, but faster than before. "Doctor says I'll get stronger," she said proudly. Jake smiled, genuine and unguarded. "I knew you would." That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Jake lay awake. Harrington's trust was conditional. Collins's suspicion was open. And beneath it all, Jake sensed something else, a resistance that had not yet shown its face. Men like Collins did not lose control easily, and they did not forgive disruption. Jake closed his eyes. He didn't know where this path led, only that turning back was no longer an option. The weather turned by midweek, not into rain, but into a heavy, pressing heat that made Abilene feel smaller than it was. The air sat still between buildings, trapping dust and sound alike. Horses moved sluggishly, men spoke less, even the rail yard seemed to hold its breath. Jake Turner noticed these things because he had learned to read the land the way other men read newspapers. When the air changed, something usually followed. He had been summoned to Harrington's office again, this time without explanation. Jake arrived just after noon, boots clean but worn, shirt neatly buttoned, hat held low in his hand as he stepped inside. The clerks glanced up as before, but their looks lingered longer now. He was no longer just a laborer passing through. He had become a question. Jake felt it in the quiet, in the way conversation stopped and resumed only after he moved on. Edward Collins intercepted him near the stairs. Collins looked as rigid as ever, dark beard trimmed precisely, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He did not greet Jake. "You'll wait," Collins said, gesturing toward a side room. His tone was clipped, professional, but there was something tight beneath it. Collins did not like uncertainty, and Jake represented too much of it. Jake nodded and waited. The room was small, furnished with a narrow table and 2 chairs. A single window looked out over the street. Jake stood rather than sit, resting one hand lightly on the back of the chair. Daisy was not with him today, and he felt her absence more than he expected. After several minutes, voices drifted in from the hallway. One was Harrington's, controlled and even. The other was unfamiliar. A woman's voice. Jake heard the door open. Edward Collins stepped aside, and William Harrington entered with a woman at his side. "Mr. Turner," Harrington said, "this is Miss Celeste Marrow." Celeste Marrow was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with an effortless posture that suggested she had never needed to make room for anyone else. Her hair was a pale blonde, pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and her dress was cut cleanly, expensive without being showy. Her face was narrow, her features sharp but symmetrical, and her skin was unmarked by sun or labor. Her eyes were green and observant, not warm, not cold, measuring. She looked at Jake the way a person looked at a locked door, assessing how difficult it would be to open. "So this is him," she said. Her voice was smooth, controlled, carrying no accent that Jake could place. "I expected someone older." Jake inclined his head slightly. "Ma'am?" Celeste's lips curved into a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "You work the yards." "Yes. And now you work here," she said, glancing around the room. "Interesting." Harrington gestured for them to sit. Jake took the chair nearest the door. Celeste sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Harrington remained standing. "Miss Marrow oversees several of my Eastern interests," Harrington said. "She has a keen sense for operations." Celeste tilted her head. "I prefer efficiency." Jake said nothing. Celeste studied him openly now, his broad shoulders, the faint scars along his jaw, the calloused hands resting calmly on his knees. She noticed the way he held himself, alert but not defensive, respectful without submission. It irritated her more than she expected. "Tell me," Celeste said, "what exactly do you do for Mr. Harrington?" "I observe," Jake replied. "When I'm asked to." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "That sounds vague." "It is," Jake said simply. Harrington watched the exchange with interest. "That will be all for now, Mr. Turner," he said. "We'll speak later." Jake stood, nodded once to Harrington, then to Celeste. As he turned to leave, he felt her eyes on his back. He did not look back. Outside, the heat pressed down harder. Jake walked back toward the rail yard, his thoughts unsettled. Celeste Marrow was not like Collins. Collins resisted change because it threatened order. Celeste resisted it because she preferred control. Jake could feel the difference. That evening, Jake stayed late at the yard. He helped a younger hand calm a spooked steer, fixed a broken latch, and listened to the low conversation of men who measured life in hours and wages. One of them, a thin man named Robert Hale, spoke quietly while tying off a rope. "They say Harrington's bringing in outside people," Hale muttered. "Women with money and sharp teeth." Jake said nothing. At home, Henry noticed Jake's silence. "Something's stirring," his father said. It was not a question. Jake nodded. "Yes." Emily sat at the table, coloring with a stub of charcoal. She looked up. "Is it bad?" Jake forced a small smile. "Not yet." That night, Daisy growled softly in her sleep, a low sound that woke Jake briefly. He listened to the house settle, the wind shift, the distant whistle of a train. He thought of Celeste Marrow's eyes, calm and assessing, and understood that the danger ahead would not announce itself loudly. The next day confirmed it. Jake was reassigned from the yard to accompany Edward Collins on a routine inspection. Collins did not explain why. He spoke little, walking briskly, clipboard in hand. "You don't belong here," Collins said abruptly as they crossed the loading platform. Jake met his gaze. "Neither do half the men you rely on." Collins stopped walking. His jaw tightened. "Careful." "I am," Jake replied. Collins resumed walking. "Miss Marrow has concerns about loyalty." Jake understood. Loyalty to what? Collins hesitated. To order. They finished the inspection without incident. Nothing was found. Nothing needed to be. The exercise was not about errors. It was about watching Jake. By late afternoon, Harrington summoned him again. Celeste was there, seated at Harrington's desk as if it belonged to her. She did not rise when Jake entered. "Mr. Turner," she said, "I've reviewed the reports you looked at earlier this week." "And?" Jake asked. "And you didn't mark anything," she said. "You didn't leave notes. You didn't suggest changes." "I wasn't asked to," Jake replied. Celeste smiled thinly. "You're either very careful or very clever." "Or I know my place," Jake said. Harrington intervened. "That will be enough." Celeste stood. She moved closer to Jake, stopping just short of his personal space. "Men like you," she said quietly, "are often unaware of how easily they can be removed." Jake met her gaze steadily. "Men like me are used to standing back up." She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned away. That evening, as Jake left the office, he noticed something new. The looks from the clerks had changed. They were no longer curious. They were cautious. Jake walked home with Daisy at his side, the dog alert, ears twitching at every sound. Emily greeted him with a hug, thin arms tight around his waist. Henry watched from his chair, saying nothing. Jake understood now. The path he was on was narrowing. Harrington trusted him, but trust invited scrutiny. Celeste Marrow did not trust him at all, and men who could not be controlled were often treated as threats. Jake lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing the next test would not come from ledgers or cattle. It would come from people. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust in still air, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. In the days following his encounter with Celeste Marrow, Jake Turner found his routine altered in small but deliberate ways. His assignments shifted without explanation. Tasks he had handled efficiently were reassigned. Meetings he had once been quietly invited to were now scheduled without his knowledge. No one confronted him directly. That was the design of it. Open conflict invited resistance. Silence encouraged doubt. Jake noticed everything. At the rail yard, men who once greeted him with nods now hesitated, glancing around before speaking. Edward Collins passed him twice in one morning without acknowledgement. When Jake attempted to ask a question about a delayed shipment, Collins responded with a curt instruction to follow protocol, something Jake had already done for years. The message was clear. Access was narrowing. Even Daisy sensed the shift. She stayed closer to Jake's side, her movements more alert, ears lifting at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps. Animals responded to tension faster than people did. Jake trusted that instinct. One afternoon, as Jake assisted with an inventory check near the western pens, a new face appeared at the yard. The man introduced himself as Caleb Pierce, recently transferred from a rail hub in Missouri. Pierce was in his late 30s, broad through the chest, with a thick brown beard that hid most of his jawline. His hair was cropped short, and a faded scar ran from his temple down toward his cheek, the kind earned in a past he didn't discuss. He spoke easily, laughed quickly, and made a point of shaking hands with everyone he met. "Good to see working men still running this place," Pierce said, clapping Jake lightly on the shoulder. "Been too many suits around lately." Jake studied him briefly. Men who announced loyalty too loudly often had reasons. Pierce lingered through the afternoon, asking questions that seemed harmless on the surface. Who signed off on which loads? How often inspections occurred? Which foremen rotated nights? Jake answered only what was necessary. He noticed Pierce asked the same questions of others, collecting answers like pieces of loose wire. That evening, Jake returned home later than usual. Emily was already asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. Henry sat at the table, rubbing his hands together slowly. "You're being watched," Henry said without looking up. Jake paused. How do you know? Henry looked at him then. Because I've seen it before. When men stop saying your name out loud, it's because they're deciding how to use it. Jake nodded. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly. I won't let it touch Emily. Henry's mouth tightened. I know. The next morning brought the first real disruption. A shipment bound for Kansas City was delayed by 3 hours due to what Collins called a documentation error. The paperwork traced the responsibility back to Jake. His initials appeared on a form he had never seen. The error cost Harrington money. Not much, but enough to be noticed. Jake was summoned immediately. Harrington stood behind his desk, expression unreadable. Celeste Marrow sat nearby, hands folded, her posture relaxed. Edward Collins stood against the wall, arms crossed. Explain this, Harrington said, sliding the paper forward. Jake examined it carefully. The handwriting was close to his, but not exact. The figures were correct, but the timing was off. I didn't sign this, Jake said. Celeste smiled faintly. Of course you didn't. Harrington raised a hand. This is not an accusation, he said. Yet. Jake looked at him steadily. Someone wants it to be. Collins shifted his weight. We reviewed the process. The document passed through your station. Jake nodded. So did half the others. Celeste leaned forward slightly. But you're the variable, Mr. Turner. The recent addition. Disruptions tend to follow disruptions. Jake said nothing. He understood now. This was not about the error. It was about placement. Harrington dismissed him without further comment. Over the next 2 days, similar issues appeared. Minor discrepancies, slight delays, each one subtle, each one tied loosely to Jake's role. The pattern was deliberate but careful, designed to look accidental. Jake began keeping his own notes, marking times, locations, and names. Years of tracking cattle had taught him how to follow trails others overlooked. One name appeared more than once, Caleb Pierce. Jake observed Pierce closely. He noticed how Pierce positioned himself near document exchanges, how he volunteered for handoffs, how he deflected attention with humor when questions grew specific. Pierce played the role of a man eager to belong. It was convincing. Too convincing. One night, as Jake prepared to leave the yard, he saw Pierce speaking quietly with Celeste Marrow near the office steps. Their conversation stopped when Jake approached. Pierce smiled broadly. Evening, Pierce said. Busy days, huh? Jake nodded. Busier than they should be. Celeste met Jake's gaze. Problems often reveal character, she said. So do solutions, Jake replied. That night, Jake did not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the distant sound of trains moving through the dark. Emily stirred once, coughing lightly. Jake rose to check on her, placing a hand gently on her back until her breathing steadied. The thought of losing ground now tightened his chest more than any physical labor ever had. By dawn, Jake had decided. He arrived early and positioned himself near the eastern loading platform where paperwork was temporarily stored before transfer to the main office. He watched Pierce arrive late, rubbing his eyes, moving with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was unseen. Jake waited. When Pierce stepped away briefly, Jake moved. He did not touch the documents. He didn't need to. He observed how they were arranged, how one folder sat slightly out of alignment. When Pierce returned, Jake saw him adjust it with practiced ease, sliding a paper beneath another. That was enough. Later that afternoon, Jake requested a private meeting with Harrington. Harrington listened in silence as Jake explained what he had seen, careful to present facts rather than conclusions. He placed his own notes on the desk, neat and methodical. Harrington read them slowly. Celeste was not present. I warned you, Harrington said finally. Men like Pierce arrive when others believe oversight is weak. Jake nodded. He's not acting alone. Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly. No. That evening, Pierce was reassigned pending review. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, the message spread quickly. Jake felt the shift immediately. Conversations resumed. Eyes met his again. But with that came something else. Resentment. Jake walked home under a sky thick with clouds. Daisy trotted beside him, alert but calm. Emily greeted him with a tired smile. Henry watched quietly from his chair. You stepped forward, Henry said. Yes, Jake replied. That means they'll step back, Henry said. and then they'll try again. Jake looked at his family, at the fragile peace he was trying to protect. I know. He lay down that night knowing the trap had not closed. It had only been tested. The week turned heavy after Pierce's removal, not with relief, but with tension that tightened like wire pulled too far. Abilene carried on with its business as always. Trains arrived, cattle moved, money changed hands. But beneath the routine ran an unease Jake Turner could feel in his bones. He had lived long enough on the range to know that when pressure vanished too quickly, it rarely meant danger was gone. More often, it meant it was repositioning. Jake continued his work without comment. He arrived early, left late, and documented everything he touched. He kept his voice calm, his posture neutral. Among the men in the yard, he remained steady and fair, helping where he could, listening more than speaking. That consistency was his armor. But armor did not stop knives that came from behind. At home, Emily's health improved slowly. The medicine Harrington's check had paid for eased her coughing, and color returned to her cheeks. She laughed more often now, quieter than other children, but genuine. Jake noticed every change. Those small improvements anchored him, reminded him why he could not afford mistakes. Henry, however, seemed more restless. They won't let this go, his father said one evening as he watched the sun set through the dusty window. You embarrassed them. Jake nodded. I didn't mean to. Henry's mouth tightened. Meaning doesn't matter when pride is involved. 2 days later, Harrington called for a full review. Jake was summoned to the main office shortly after noon. The building felt different as he entered, quieter than usual. Clerks avoided his eyes. Edward Collins stood near the wall, stiff and pale, his beard trimmed as always, but his posture tighter, as if he were bracing himself. Celeste Marrow was already there. She stood near Harrington's desk, dressed in dark blue, her pale hair pinned neatly, her expression composed. She looked entirely at ease, as though she belonged at the center of the room. Jake felt the shift immediately. This meeting had weight. Harrington did not offer a seat. Mr. Turner, he said, we've uncovered a serious issue. Jake remained standing. I'm listening. Harrington slid several documents across the desk. Jake recognized his name before he recognized the handwriting. Shipping manifests, authorization slips, a transfer record. You accessed restricted schedules, Harrington said, and relayed them to an outside party. Jake's chest tightened. He picked up the papers, his hands steady despite the sudden pressure. He examined the signatures. His initials were there, close enough to be convincing. The timing aligned with shifts he had worked. The records were thorough. They're forged, Jake said quietly. Celeste tilted her head. That's a serious claim. Jake looked at her. So is yours. Harrington's gaze hardened. There's more. He placed another document on the desk, a bank transfer receipt, a sum large. Enough to feed Jake's family for years. Jake stared at it. I've never seen this. The funds were deposited under your name, Harrington said. This morning. Jake felt the room narrow. He thought of Emily, of Henry, of Daisy waiting by the door each evening. I didn't take it. Celeste stepped closer. Her voice remained calm, almost sympathetic. Desperation drives people to unfortunate decisions, Mr. Turner. You carry responsibility others here do not. Jake met her gaze steadily. That's why I wouldn't do this. Edward Collins finally spoke. The access logs show your station. The paperwork passed through your hands. Jake turned toward him. So did Pierce's, and yours. Collins stiffened. Careful. Harrington raised a hand. Enough. He looked at Jake, his expression no longer testing, no longer curious. It was guarded now. Hurt, though he would never admit it. I trusted you, Harrington said. I defended you. Jake felt that land harder than the accusation. And I didn't betray that. Silence filled the room. Outside, a train whistle blew, long and distant. You are suspended, Harrington said finally. Effective immediately. Your access is revoked. You will leave Abilene by morning. Jake stared at him. You're asking me to abandon my family. I'm protecting my operation, Harrington replied. This matter will be investigated. If you are cleared, we will speak again. Celeste's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, a conclusion. Jake gathered the papers and placed them back on the desk. "You're making a mistake." Harrington did not respond. 2 guards escorted Jake from the building. Their grip was firm but not cruel. Men he had worked alongside watched silently as he passed. No one spoke, not because they believed he was guilty, but because fear was louder than loyalty. The walk home felt longer than usual. Daisy met him at the door, tail low, sensing the shift before he spoke. Emily looked up from her chair. "Uncle Jake?" she asked. "Why are you home early?" Jake knelt in front of her. He took her small hands in his rough ones. "We're going to rest for a bit," he said. "That's all." Henry understood immediately. He said nothing until Emily was asleep. "They cut you loose," Henry said. "Yes." Henry closed his eyes briefly. "Then they mean to finish it." That night, Jake packed only what was necessary. He didn't run. He would not. But he prepared. Before dawn, he walked to the yard one last time, not to steal or confront, but to look. He noted where records were stored, who moved first, who avoided his gaze. He saw Pierce's name scratched faintly on a chalkboard, recently erased. He saw Celeste's carriage near the office long after dark. The truth was there, buried but not gone. Jake returned home as the sky lightened. Emily slept. Daisy rested her head on Jake's boot. Henry watched from the table. "They think they've broken you," Henry said. Jake shook his head. "They've only taken away what they could see." He lay down without sleep, staring at the ceiling, knowing that the ground beneath him had given way, but also knowing that men who learned to ride horses in storms did not drown easily. The fight was no longer about trust. It was about survival. Jake Turner did not leave Abilene at dawn, despite the order that said he should. He waited instead, letting the morning come and go while the town resumed its rhythm around him. Trains whistled, wagons rolled, men went to work. Life rarely paused for injustice. Jake understood that. He had lived long enough knowing the world did not stop simply because a man had been wronged. But he also knew something else. Dust remembered. By mid-morning, Jake walked back toward the west edge of town, away from the rail office and the places where he was expected to disappear. Daisy stayed close, her head low, her pace matched to his. She was 7 now, her muzzle beginning to gray, but her eyes remained sharp. She sensed intention the way cattle sense storms. Jake did not go to confront Harrington. He did not go to plead his case. He went where the truth had been shaped before it was written down. The western loading yards lay quieter than the main rail hub, used mostly for overflow and temporary holding. Fewer clerks came here, fewer eyes. Jake had worked these pens long enough to know which men took shortcuts and which ones didn't. One name stood apart in his mind, Jonah Reed. Reed was a dockhand in his early 40s, tall but slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller than he was. His beard was thick and black, shot through with gray, usually untrimmed. His hands were massive, fingers bent crooked from old breaks that had never healed right. Reed spoke little, but when he did, he spoke carefully. Years earlier, a collapsing loading ramp had killed a man beside him. Reed survived, but the foreman blamed him anyway. Since then, Reed trusted procedure more than people, and silence more than words. Jake found him repairing a loose hinge near an empty pen. "Morning," Jake said. Reed looked up slowly. His eyes flicked to Jake's face, then to Daisy, then back again. "You're not supposed to be here." "I know," Jake replied. "I won't be long." Reed returned to his work. "Everyone's got eyes on them right now." "That's why I came here," Jake said. "Fewer people think to look." Reed paused. His shoulders shifted slightly. "They say you're finished." "They say a lot of things." Silence stretched between them. The wind moved through the slats of the fencing, carrying the familiar smell of hay and animal sweat. Daisy sat at Jake's feet, watching Reed closely. "You handled the East manifests last week," Jake said finally. "The ones transferred before the delay." Reed's jaw tightened. "I handled what I was told to handle." "Did you see who brought them?" Jake asked. Reed hesitated. That alone was an answer. "It was Pierce," Reed said quietly. "Late evening. He said Collins wanted the copies rushed." "Did Collins say that?" Jake asked. Reed shook his head once. "Didn't hear it from him." Jake nodded. "Did anyone else see Pierce?" Reed glanced toward the office. "Buildings in the distance. Miss Marrow's driver waited nearby. Carriage stayed longer than usual." That was enough. Jake did not press further. Reed had said what he could. Pressing him would only close doors. Jake thanked him, clapped his shoulder once, and left. By early afternoon, Jake had pieced together the shape of it. Not proof yet. Shape. Pierce had been the hand, Celeste the architect, Collins the shield, Harrington the weight holding it all together. But Harrington would not listen to shape. He would listen to certainty. Jake needed something that could not be erased. He went next to the freight sheds near the southern track, where older records were stored before being moved or burned. The building was watched, but not closely. No one expected a dismissed cowboy to return quietly. Inside, the air smelled of paper and damp wood. Jake moved carefully, reading labels, opening crates. Daisy stayed near the door, ears alert. Jake searched until he found what he suspected would still exist: the manual logbooks. Not the polished summaries, but the handwritten records kept by men who trusted pen more than machines. He worked methodically, cross-referencing dates Jonah Reed had mentioned with entries written in different hands. He noticed inconsistencies in timing, documents logged twice, transfers marked earlier than possible. And then he found it. A ledger signed by Pierce, another signed by Collins, and between them an unsigned notation referencing a private schedule review, approved verbally by CM Celeste Marrow. Jake exhaled slowly. It was not a confession, but it was evidence of orchestration. Enough to raise doubt, enough to stop the narrative from closing around him. As he turned to leave, voices sounded outside. Jake froze. Through a crack in the door, he saw two men approach. One was Collins, the other was unfamiliar. The second man introduced himself loudly as Samuel Fitch, an investigator hired by Harrington. Fitch was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with a heavy jaw and thick mustache that drooped at the edges. His hair was thinning, his coat worn at the elbows. He carried himself like a man who had spent years breaking up disputes rather than solving them cleanly. He believed people revealed the truth eventually, if pressed hard enough. "They said Turner might try something," Fitch said. Collins' voice was tight. "If he's here, we'll know soon enough." Jake did not move. Daisy remained still, breathing slow. When the men passed the door without opening it, Jake waited until their voices faded, then slipped out the opposite side. He didn't go home. He went to the one place Harrington still believed in: results. Near sunset, Jake requested a meeting. Harrington did not agree immediately, but an hour later, Jake was allowed inside under supervision. Celeste was not present. Jake placed the ledger on Harrington's desk without a word. Harrington read slowly, his face unreadable. When he reached the notation, his fingers stopped. "Explain," Harrington said. Jake did, calmly, clearly, without accusation. He laid out the sequence, the overlaps, the names. He mentioned Reed without naming him directly. He mentioned Pierce only when necessary. "This doesn't prove intent," Harrington said finally. "No," Jake agreed, "but it proves direction." Silence stretched between them. Harrington leaned back, the lines in his face deepening. "If you're wrong—" "I won't ask for my position back," Jake said. "Only that you don't finish the story before it's been read." Harrington looked at him then. Really looked. Not as a worker, not as a threat, as a man who had chosen to stand still while the ground moved under him. "You have until tomorrow," Harrington said. "Then this ends." Jake nodded. That was all he needed. He walked home in the dark, Daisy at his side. Emily slept when he arrived. Henry sat at the table, waiting. "You found something," Henry said. "Yes." "Enough?" Jake looked at the ledger in his hand. "Enough to keep breathing." He lay down that night knowing the next day would decide more than his name. It would decide whether truth still mattered to powerful men. The morning arrived without ceremony. No thunder, no sudden storm. Just the slow light of day, stretching over Abilene, touching the rails, the yards, the rooftops, and finally, the people who carried its weight. Jake Turner woke before sunrise, not from fear, but from habit. He dressed quietly, boots worn smooth by years of honest work, shirt clean but patched, movement steady. Daisy rose with him, tail wagging once before settling into her familiar calm. She sensed finality in the air, the way animals often did when something important was about to end or begin. Henry was already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His posture was straight despite the stiffness in his leg, his eyes clear. "Whatever happens today," Henry said, "you've done what you could." Jake nodded. "That's all any man can do." Emily stirred in her sleep. Jake watched her for a moment, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the color in her cheeks that had returned over the past weeks. He leaned down and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, careful not to wake her. Then he stepped outside. The rail office stood quieter than usual when Jake arrived. Fewer clerks lingered near the entrance. Word had traveled, as it always did. Harrington was deciding something, and men who depended on him preferred not to be too close when that happened. Edward Collins met Jake at the door. His face looked drawn, the sharpness in his eyes dulled by a sleepless night. For the first time since Jake had known him, Collins hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Harrington is waiting," Collins said. Jake followed him upstairs. The office door was open. Harrington stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. Celeste Marrow was seated at the desk, posture perfect, expression unreadable. Samuel Fitch stood near the wall, hat in hand, observing quietly. Harrington turned as Jake entered. "You said yesterday that truth leaves marks," Harrington said. "I've spent the night looking for them." Celeste did not look at Jake. Her gaze remained fixed on Harrington, confident, expectant. Harrington crossed the room and placed several documents on the desk. "Mr. Fitch," he said, "what did you find?" Fitch cleared his throat. "I traced the manual ledgers Mr. Turner provided. They align with transfer gaps not reflected in the formal summaries. I questioned 2 clerks. One admitted Pierce instructed him to backdate entries. Another confirmed Miss Marrow's driver delivered private schedules on 3 occasions." Celeste finally turned. Her smile was calm but thinner now. "Circumstantial." Fitch nodded. "On their own, yes. Together, less so." Harrington looked at Celeste. "You told me Turner was a liability." "I told you he was unpredictable," Celeste replied smoothly, "and now he's orchestrated this performance to save himself." Jake said nothing. He had learned that truth did not need decoration. Harrington picked up the bank transfer receipt. "This was authorized from my private account," he said. "At an hour I was asleep." Celeste met his gaze evenly. "You often sleep through important matters." Silence fell. Harrington turned to Collins. "Who had access to my account authorization codes?" Collins swallowed. "Miss Marrow did, as part of the Eastern Oversight Agreement." Harrington nodded once. "Thank you." Celeste stood. "William, think carefully. This man has nothing to lose. I have protected your interests for years." Harrington's voice was quiet when he replied, "That's the problem. You protected what benefited you." Celeste's composure cracked for the first time. Not anger, disbelief. "You're choosing him over me?" "I'm choosing the truth," Harrington said. "And the truth is simpler than you thought." He gestured to Fitch. "Escort Miss Marrow out. Her authority is revoked effective immediately. I will speak with legal counsel regarding the misuse of funds." Celeste's eyes hardened. "You're making a mistake." Harrington did not respond. Fitch stepped forward. Celeste collected her gloves slowly, her movements controlled to the end. As she passed Jake, she stopped briefly. "You think this makes you equal?" she said quietly. "It doesn't." Jake met her gaze. "No, it makes me clean." She left without another word. The room felt larger once she was gone. Harrington turned to Jake. "I was wrong," he said. "I let fear of disorder blind me to intent." Jake inclined his head. "It happens." Harrington studied him. "You could have fled. You didn't. You could have stolen. You didn't. You could have begged. You didn't." Jake shrugged slightly. "I had people depending on me." Harrington nodded. "Exactly." He crossed the room and extended his hand. Jake hesitated only a moment before taking it. Harrington's grip was firm, not dominant. "I won't pretend this fixes everything," Harrington said, "but I can offer you a choice. Return to the yard as before, or stay here officially, not as an observer, as an operations supervisor for the western routes." Jake considered it carefully. He thought of the open pens, the men he worked beside, the rhythm of honest labor. He also thought of Emily's medicine, Henry's care, and the men like Jonah Reed who needed someone willing to speak plainly. "I'll take the role," Jake said. but I won't stop walking the yards." Harrington smiled faintly. "I wouldn't trust you if you did." Later that afternoon, Jake returned home early. Emily was awake, sitting at the table with Henry, drawing carefully. "Uncle Jake," she said when she saw him, "you're smiling." Jake laughed softly. "Guess I am." Henry watched him closely. "It's done?" "Yes," Jake said. "For now." That evening, the yard buzzed with quiet relief. Jonah Reed nodded to Jake as he passed. Men spoke, openly again. Daisy lay near Jake's feet, content, her work done. Weeks passed, changes followed, procedures tightened, shortcuts disappeared. Men were held accountable without cruelty. Harrington visited the yards more often, listening instead of commanding. Jake became a steady presence, not elevated above others, but rooted among them. In time, Harrington funded a small medical trust for rail workers' families. It was named simply, without ceremony. Emily Turner was the first child it helped. On a clear morning weeks later, Jake stood at the edge of the pens, Daisy beside him, watching cattle move calmly up the ramp. He felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, earned and honest. Henry sat nearby, the sun on his face. Emily laughed as she chased a grasshopper near the fence. Jake had not become a rich man. He had not escaped work or dust or responsibility, but he had gained something rarer. A place where the measure of a man was taken not by power or polish, but by what he refused to surrender when it mattered most. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a man who refuses to lie, through a hand that keeps working even when the world turns away, through a heart that chooses love when fear would be easier. Jake Turner did not win because he was powerful. He won because he stayed honest when no one was watching. And maybe that's how God still works today. Not always by changing the world around us, but by strengthening the spirit within us so we can endure one more day and protect the ones placed in our care. In our own lives, we may not face railroads or false accusations, but we all carry quiet burdens. A sick child, a lonely heart, a season where it feels like no one is listening. If this story reminds you that you are not forgotten, if it whispers that God still sees the small, the tired, and the faithful, then let that hope stay with you today. Please share this story with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you or where you're watching from. And if you believe that faith, kindness, and perseverance still matter, subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories like this together. May God bless you. May He protect your family, your children, and the animals who trust you. And may He grant you strength for today and hope for tomorrow. Thank you for watching. You are not alone.